My name is Peter Lorien. That hasn't always been my name. I am endeavoring to tell a story, how I am implicated and connected to the land that I live on. Right now I'm in my backyard. It's overcast. How did I get here? How did I come to live here? These aren't the lands that I was born on. These aren't the lands that I grew up in. It's too expensive to live in a big city. It was out of a desire to have a simpler life, a life that's more connected to the land that we live on. I didn't grow up here. This isn't where I'm from, and it's most definitely not where my ancestors come from. I hope to tell how it's a struggle and it's a process to uproot the settler that we all have, the settler within us. And I am choosing to tell this story after working physically at removing the English ivy that someone decided to put on this land. Someone brought here with good intent, I'm sure. And it's interesting how hostile these plants are, almost parasitic. The ivy wraps itself around the tree, kills it, kills the tree as a parasite, takes over and colonizes the forest. And we see remnants of it, and we see the resiliency too of the forest. But I am standing about 4 meters away from a huge tall cedar tree that was taken down by the English ivy here in my yard. It also spreads across to the neighbors and colonizes that property as well. So I really think of this work as kind of like being a metaphor for the work of trying to be an ally to Indigenous people. The cemetery was laid out according to feng shui principles. The site faces towards the rising sun, protected northwards by a forest of trees, and good spirits were not drained out by the flowing streams. My people aren't buried here. I don't know where I'll be buried. Being amongst the dead makes me think about my past and my ancestors, and the only connection I have to that is my elders and my parents. And they have lost a lot of their knowledge and their tradition and have been displaced many times. It's sad to think about the people here not being remembered, not being seen. I think it's telling that the highway is right near the cemetery. The settler population changes. It hasn't always been, 700,000 people. It used to be a small village, and I'm sure a lot of the relationships with Indigenous people were much more interpersonal, and we didn't just drive through the Comox Reserve on our way to Comox. I think about Gord Hill and the Oka crisis, the so-called Oka crisis. Our child is named Oka Ren, and in the political community that we were a part of in Vancouver, people would think we were referencing Oka. But yeah, they call it the Oka crisis, but it was really called Kanasatage, and they wanted to put a golf course on the cemetery, the place where people remember where they come from, where they bury their dead. And they were not going to let that happen. And yeah, I think about those things. A lot of talk about reconciliation these days, but what does it really mean? For me, there is no meaningful reconciliation without giving the land back to the Indigenous people and letting them have control over the territories. Across from the Chinese cemetery, there was a protest, a blockade of the highway, which drew lots of controversy. It was really important to bring my kid there, Oka Ren. One of the unfortunate mishaps of the organizers, I did not organize this event, but I came to support, was that they attributed their solidarity towards the Comox Nation. And this was really misguided and a form of tokenism, and it was very unfortunate. And they ended up being called out by the Comox Nation because they didn't actually have a relationship with them. I think it would have been better if they just said that they were doing it in solidarity with the hereditary chiefs of the Wet'suwet'en. A big part of my life and my identity has been wrapped up in being an activist and ally with Indigenous people. But the more I've been involved, the more I've learned that it's more important to listen. Sometimes it's better to listen than to do work. Sometimes if we do work in an irresponsible way, it can create harm, with an understanding that it's quite complicated to uproot the settler within us. For me, it is a long process of decolonizing myself, and I've been encouraged by Indigenous people to get to know my ancestors and understand where I come from and where my people come from. Rather than feeling guilt and shame for the crimes of my ancestors and the privileges I hold today, I think it is better to see our role as a responsibility and to support Indigenous struggles to protect the land. In my attempt to explore place and land, I took my family, my mother who was visiting, and my small child to a place called Forbidden Plateau. It's just, it's up the hill, up the mountains. It's about a 25-minute drive up a gravel road to a subalpine region where people go skiing and practice all kinds of recreational sports. And there's a very beautiful view of the whole valley. So that was a very, beautiful kind of encapsulating place that links me to place. One of the things that was there before was the ruins of a burnt down ski resort. But I wanted to do more research about this place in the valley and if there are any stories connecting it. And on the Wikipedia article, a legend that's attributed to the Comox people. And the article, or the section of the Wikipedia article, is as follows. When the Comox faced raids from other coastal tribes, they took their women and children to the plateau for safekeeping. During a raid by the Cowichan, the women and children vanished without a trace. When a member of the tribe went to look for the women and children within the Forbidden Plateau, he found red lichen covering the snow and nearby rocks and assumed the lichen to be blood of the family members. Since then, the plateau has become taboo, for it was believed that it was inhabited by evil spirits who consumed those who had been sent there. This was a really interesting legend or folk tale, and I wanted to find out more information. So I clicked on the Wikipedia article. The first link sent me to a dead page, a dead link for the British Columbia Folklore Society. The second link was an article from that same website, the British Columbia Folklore Society, but it was from the Wayback Machine. So for some reason, the link has been expired, and yet someone recorded it to try to keep it as a Wikipedia article. So this really intrigued my interest, and I wanted to do more research and ideally find a Comox source from the Comox Nation. What I did find after doing more research was an article by Ruth Masters, and we also, you'll see, my family went during the quarantine to Ruth Masters Park, and which overlooks the Puntledge River. And she was a very well-known community activist in the valley. And so she had a few things to say about it. And this is from an article by the Strathcona Society. And it outlines what her findings are about the legend. Quoting Ruth Masters from the article, "Nowhere in my searches did I find an authentic Indian story or legend dealing with the plateau. The, quote, forbidden idea appears to have originated from the Comox Angler editor Ben Hughes reading of a diary of Dr. Robert Brown, early explorer of Vancouver Island, who in 1864 recorded that the Comox Indians declined to accompany his parties up into the Puntledge River country for fear of vengeance from Seashelt being too great, and the attraction of the salmon fishery now commencing too strong for them. From this small beginnings, all the yearnings about evil spirits, hairy monsters, Indian women and children being murdered up there, red snow representing their blood, and so on, appears to have originated from this one story, from this one person. I believe the Indian legends referred to in the numerous accounts about the naming of Forbidden Plateau will stem from a fertile imagination of early plateau promoters and explorers, namely the late Clinton Woods, who saw the potential for recreation at the plateau, and the journalist and editor Ben Hughes. Ruth Masters, the Indigenous people, the Comox people, didn't want to follow the explorers up to the mountain because it was fishing season and they had no reason to go up to the mountain. And yet this myth, this legend, has taken on a life of its own. It's still cited in the Wikipedia article, even though there is no credible evidence that this is a story of the Comox people, because they wanted to promote the plateau and encourage people to come and settle in the lands here. Kind of Indigenous story is the story of Forbidden Plateau. It is a story attributed to Indigenous people, but it is not one of them. It's not one that they share or tell, and yet it's one that we know and has become folklore. Why does an Indigenous story or an Indian story have more authenticity or create more wonder for a place? It's an interesting story, and a big part of me, the activist part of me, really wants to go and fix this poorly cited article. And it makes me think about the credibility of Wikipedia, where they have a cited source, and how do you source a story? How do you source a legend? How do you misrepresent a people? So it made me think about another story. It comes from a website for the Comox Valley School District and their Indigenous education section. This story is attributed to Mary Clifton, and it was written down by Barbara Frank. This is the legend of Quinish. Quinish is the Comox name for the gleaming white glacier, which is seen all over the Comox Valley. The legend of Quinish tells us of how a great white whale saved the Comox people. It began long ago when the Comox people still lived in big cedar plank houses along the shores of the Puntledge River estuary. One night, an elder in the village had a powerful dream. It warned him of a coming time when the rains would fall for many days and nights. In this dream, he was told that this rain would cause a great flood and the Comox people would be in danger. In order for them to survive the flood, they would have to make canoes, cedar bark ropes and clothing, and preserve food for the coming disaster. The chief of the Comox people directed them to work together and get ready for the big rains. The elder supervised the making of a strong cedar bark rope, which was many miles in length. The rope had been long enough to reach from the village to the top of the glacier. As foretold, the rains began to fall just as everything was ready. The river rose rapidly to flood stage. Young men carried long cedar ropes from the village to the mountains and attached it securely to the glacier. The people tied their loaded canoes to the rope so they wouldn't get swept away into the sea by the flooded waters. Soon the land was covered with water, and still it continued to rain. The people were afraid the water would continue to rise up to the glacier where they had anchored their canoes. Suddenly the glacier began to float, breaking up through the rising waters like a giant gray whale breaching. The people were awestruck as they watched the glacier become a huge white whale. Quinish, Quinish, they called. Quinish almost floated free from the mountains, but the rains stopped and the flooded waters began to recede. The Comox people were saved. Some still whisper to him, Quinish, thank you, thank you. The legend of Quinish really resonates with me.
because a big part of why I live here is grounded in the fact that there is a intact glacier. Some people say that it's no longer a glacier because it melts away in the summer. And I think the kind of gathering for the storm is also something that really resonates with me. A big part of why I moved to live in the Comox Valley was out of kind of an apocalyptic desire to be somewhere where I can live more on the land and have more of a relationship to the land. You know, the glacier feeds the whole valley with fresh water, and the whole estuary is alive with life because of the glacier, and we must protect it, and we must work together to do so. It still makes me wonder, though, what right do I have to this story, this legend of Quinish? Is it acceptable for me to share and tell this story to my kid so that they have a relationship to this place and care about it and want to protect it? Or is this another theft of my people, stealing not only the land, but the culture and the history and the stories?
I think that a lot of cultures that where they maintain a oral tradition to maintain their stories, that is essential to being human in my view. And I feel like as a colonized white settler, cishet, all the isms, I have lost that. That's a loss for me. It's something I grieve, that I don't have a history, a culture, or a story.